Well, that's a way to handle things. Go into your own personal quarantine and let the rest of the country burn. I don't understand what the notes mean. We're gonna skip the notes. We could say that 2020 could have been written by Edgar Allan Poe. Well, hello there. Welcome back to my channel. My name is Ashley. Guess what I learned? Somebody wrote a book about pandemics and plagues. And the second I found out that Edgar Allan Poe had written a short story about pandemics, I'm here. I mean, if we're feeling generous, we could say that 2020 could have been written by Edgar Allan Poe. I mean, and it's just moving straight into 2021. I am not sure I am prepared for the emotional journey that this is gonna take me on, but here we go. Pull up a chair and sit on the floor. I'll tell you a tale I never heard before. Alright, The Masque of the Red Death. Only Masque is spelled fancy, M-A-S-Q-U-E. So, I don't know if that will be important, that it is spelled weird, but we're about to find out. The Red Death. Already we're starting off with notes. I guess we'll read the notes. I don't understand what the notes mean. We're gonna skip the notes. The Red Death had long devastated the country. No pestilence had ever been so fatal or so hideous. Blood was its avatar and its seal. The redness and the horror of blood. There were sharp pains and sudden dizziness, and then profuse bleeding at the pores, with dissolution. The scarlet stains upon the body, and especially upon the face of the victim, were the pest ban which shut him out from the aid and from the sympathy of his fellow men, and the whole seizure, progress, and termination of the disease were the incidents of half an hour. Wow, that is quite a plague to kill somebody in half an hour. Honestly, though, if it's killing its host that fast, that's not a very good plague, because you want a host that can help spread you to other hosts. I've learned a little bit too much about disease and plagues this past year. But the Prince Prospero was happy and dauntless and sagacious. Apparently Prince Prospero is one of Poe's ironic names, because the prince does not prosper. Ooh, foreshadowing. Prince Prospero was happy and dauntless and sagacious. When his dominions were half depopulated, holy crap, half his people have died, he summoned to his presence 1,000 hale and light-hearted friends from among the knights and dames of his courts, and with these retired to the deep seclusion of one of his castled abbeys. Well, that's a way to handle things. Go into your own personal quarantine and let the rest of the country burn. This was an extensive and magnificent structure, the creation of the prince's own eccentric yet august taste. August taste? Interesting. A strong and lofty wall girdled it in. This wall had gates of iron. The courtiers, having entered, brought furnaces and Massey hammers and wielded the bolts. What is a Massey hammer? They resolved to leave means neither of ingress nor egress to the sudden impulse of desire or of frenzy from within. The abbey was amply provisioned, with such precautions that the courtiers might bid defiance to contagion. Oh, good! The external world could take care of itself. In the meantime, it was folly to grieve or to think. I have so many issues with that sentence, but we're gonna go on. The prince had provided all of the appliances of pleasure. There were buffoons, there were improvisers, there were ballet dancers, there were musicians, there was beauty, there was wine. All these in security were within. Without was the Red Death. Off to a great start. It was toward the close of the 5th or 6th month of his seclusion, and while the pestilence raged most furiously abroad, that the Prince Prospero entertained his 1,000 friends at the masked ball of the most unusual magnificence. It was a voluptuous scene, that masquerade, but first let me tell you of the room in which it was held. There were 7, an imperial suite. In many palaces, however, such suites form a long and straight vista, while the folding doors slide back nearly to the walls on either hand, so that the view of the whole extent is scarcely impeded. Here the case was very different. It might have been expected from the Duke's love of the bizarre. The apartments were so irregularly disposed that the vision embraced but little more than one at a time. There was a sharp turn every 20 or 30 yards, and at each turn a novel effect. To the right and left, in the middle of each wall, a tall, narrow Gothic window looked out upon a closed corridor which pursued the windings of the suite. The windows were of stained glass, whose color varied in accordance with the prevailing hue of the decorations of the chamber into which it opened. That at the eastern extremity was hung, for example, in blue, and vividly blue were its windows. The second chamber was purple in its ornaments and tapestries, and here the panes were purple. The third was green throughout, and so were the casements. The fourth was furnished and lighted with orange, the fifth with white, the sixth with violet. Question. White stained glass window? Is that effective? Also, I thought stained glass windows were most effective when the sun was shining through them. But I also have zero experience with stained glass windows, so I don't know. The seventh apartment was closely shrouded in black velvet tapestries that hung all over the ceiling and down the walls, falling in heavy folds upon the carpet of the same material and hue. But in this chamber only the color of the window failed to correspond with the decorations. The panes here were scarlet, a deep blood color. Well, I mean blood and black. Blood and black. Red and black do go very well together. Now, no one of these 7 apartments was there any lamp or candelabrum amid the profusion of golden ornaments that lay scattered to and fro or depending from the roof. There was no light of any kind emanating from lamp or candle within the suite of the chambers. Then how do you see the windows? What's the point of the windows? I'm confused. But in the corridors that followed the suite, there stood, opposite to each window, a heavy tripod bearing a brazier of fire that projected its ray through the tinted glass and so glaringly illuminated the room. Okay, thank you for answering my question. And thus were produced a multitude of gaudy and fantastic appearances. But in the western or black chamber, the effect of the firelight that streamed upon the dark hangings through the blood-tinted panes was ghastly in the extreme, and produced so wild a look upon the countenances of those who entered, that there were few of the company bold enough to set foot within its precinct at all. Dun, dun, dun. It was in this apartment also, I'm disappointed by the fact that the plague has not been brought up again, so I'll just leave you with that thought. It was in this apartment also that there stood against the western wall a gigantic clock of ebony. Its pendulum swung to and fro from a dull, heavy, monotonous clang, and when the minute hand made the circuit of the face and the hour was to be stricken, there came from the brazen lungs of the clock a sound which was clear and loud and deep and exceedingly musical, but of so peculiar a note and emphasis that each lapse of an hour the musicians of the orchestra were constrained to pause momentarily in their performance to hearken to the sound, and thus the waltzers perforce ceased their evolutions, and there was a brief disconcert of the whole gay company. And while the chimes of the clock yet rang, it was observed that the giddiest grew pale and more aged and sedate, passing their hands over their brows, as if in confused reverie or meditation. But when the echoes had fully ceased, a light laughter at once prevailed the assembly. That's creepy. Everybody freaks out when the clock strikes and then goes right back to normal afterward. That's creepy. The musicians looked at each other and smiled as if at their own nervousness and folly, and made whispering vows, each to the other, that the next chiming of the clock should produce in them no similar emotion. And then, after the lapse of 60 minutes, which embraces 3,600 seconds of the time that flies, there came yet another chiming of the clock, and then the same disconcert and tremulousness and meditation as before. But in spite of these things, it was a gay and magnificent revel. The tastes of the Duke were peculiar. He had a fine eye for colors and effects. His disregard of the decora of mere fashion. Decora? Beauty or arrangement in Latin. In English, decor may mean a staged setting, which would also be appropriate and ironic in the context of Prosper's wish for an elaborate show. His plans were bold and fiery, and his conceptions glowed with barbaric luster. There are some who would have thought him mad. His followers felt that he was not. Well, I mean, if you're following somebody you think is mad, you probably aren't going to follow them. Like, that's just an interesting irony. His followers felt that he was not. It was necessary to hear and see and touch him to be sure that he was not. He had directed in great part the movable embellishments of the 7 chambers upon occasion of this great fete. This is party, lavish party or entertainment, but the word is French. Fete, I think. And it was his own guiding taste which had given character to the masquerades. Be sure they were grotesque. There was much glare and glitter in Piccini. in Phantasm, much of which had been seen in Hernini, a stage play written by Victor Hugo. There were arabesques, figures with unsuited limbs and appointments. There were delirious fancies, such as the madman fashions. There were much of the beautiful, much of the wan, much of the bizarre, something of the terrible, and not a little of that which might have excited disgust. And the dreams writhed in and about, taking hue from the rooms, and causing the wild music of the orchestra to seem as an echo of their step. And anon there strikes the ebony clock, which stands in the hall of velvet. And then, for a moment, all is still, and all is silent save for the voice of the clock. The dreams are stiff frozen as they stand, but the echoes of the chime die away. They have endured but an instant, and a light, half-subdued laughter floats after them as they depart. And now again the music swells, and the dreams live, and writhe to and fro, more merrily than ever, taking hue from the many tinted windows through which stream the rays from the tripods. But to the chamber which lies most westwardly of the seven, there are now none of the maskers who venture, for night is waning away, and there flows a ruddier light through the blood-colored panes, and the blackness of the sable drapery appalls. And to him whose foot falls upon the sable carpet there comes from the near clock of ebony a muffled peal more solemnly emphatic than any which reaches their ears, who indulge in the more remote gaieties of the other apartments. But these other apartments were densely crowded, and in them beat feverishly the heart of life. And the revel went whiningly on until, I love that, the revel went whiningly on, introvert also again, until at length there commenced the sound of midnight upon the clock, and then the music ceased, as I have told, and the evolutions of the waltzers were quieted, and there was an uneasy cessation of all things as before. But now there were 12 strokes to be sounded by the bell of the clock, and thus it happened, perhaps, the more of thought crept with more of time into the meditations of the thoughtful among those who revelled. And thus, too, it happened, perhaps, that before the last echoes of the last chime had utterly sunk into silence, there were many individuals in the crowd who had found leisure to become aware of the presence of a masked figure, which had arrested the attention of no single individual before, and the rumor of the new presence having spread itself whisperingly around, there arose at length from the whole company a buzz, or murmur, expressive of disapprobation and surprise, then finally of terror, of horror, and disgust. In the assembly of phantasms such as I have painted, it may well be supposed that no ordinary appearance could have excited such sensation. In truth, the masquerade license of the night was nearly unlimited, but the figure in question had out-Heroded Herod, and gone beyond the bounds of even the prince's indefinite decorum. There are chords in the heart of the most reckless, which cannot be touched without emotion. Even with the utterly lost, to whom life and death are equally just, there are matters of which no jest can be made. The whole company, indeed, seemed now deeply to feel that in the costume and bearing of the stranger neither wit nor propriety existed. The word wit came up, and I had a strong moment where I thought, oh, Hoyd, wit, from Brandon Sanderson's The Starlight Archive, has just showed up in this party. And that's not the case, but I wish it was. That would be amazing. Let's see. The whole company indeed seemed now deeply to feel that in the costume and bearing of the stranger neither wit nor propriety existed. The figure was tall and gaunt, and shrouded from head to foot in the habiliments of the grave. The mask which concealed the visage was made so nearly to resemble the countenance of a stiffened corpse that the closest scrutiny must have had difficulty in detecting the cheat. And yet all this might have been endured, if not approved, by the mad revellers around. But the murmurs had gone so far as to assume the type of the Red Death. His vesture was dabbled in blood, and his broad brow, with all the features of the face, was bespeckled with scarlet horror. When the eyes of the Prince Prospero fell upon this spectral image, which, with a slow and solemn movement, as if it were more fully to sustain its role, stalked to and fro among the waltzers, he was seen to be convulsed in the first moment with a strong shudder either of terror or distaste, but in the next his brow reddened with rage. "Who dares," he demanded hoarsely of the courtiers who stood near him, "who dares insult us with this blasphemous mockery? Seize him and unmask him, that we may know whom we have to hang at sunrise from the battlements." That seems a little harsh. It was in the eastern or blue chamber in which stood the Prince Prospero as he uttered these words. They rang throughout the 7 rooms loudly and clearly, for the prince was a bold and robust man, and the music had become hushed at the waving of his hand. It was in the blue room where stood the prince with a group of pale courtiers by his side. At first, as he spoke, there was a slight rushing movement of the group in the direction of the intruder, who, at that moment, was also near at hand, and now, with deliberate and stately step, made closer approach to the speaker. But from a certain nameless awe with which the mad assumptions of the murmur had inspired the whole party, there were found none who put forth hand to seize him, so that unimpeded he passed within a yard of the prince's person, and while the vast assembly, as if it were one impulse, shrank from the centres of the room to the wall, he made his way uninterruptedly, but with the same solemn and measured step which had distinguished him from the first, through the blue chamber to the purple, through the purple to the green, through the green to the orange, through this again to the white, and even thence to the violet, ere a decided movement had been made to arrest him. It was then, however, that Prince Prospero, maddened with rage and the shame of his own momentary cowardice, rushed hurriedly through the 6 chambers, while none followed him on account of the deadly terror that had seized upon all. He bore aloft a drawn dagger, and had approached in a rapid impetuosity to within 3 or 4 feet of the retreating figure, when the latter, having attained the extremity of the velvet apartment, turned suddenly and confronted his pursuer. There was a sharp cry, and the dagger dropped gleaming upon the sable carpet, upon which, instantly afterward, fell prostrate in death Prince Prospero. Then, summoning the wild courage of despair, a throng of the revellers at once threw themselves into the black apartment, and seizing the murmur, whose tall figure stood erect and motionless within the shadows of the ebony cloak, gasped in unutterable horror at finding the grave cremens and the corpse-like mask which they had handled with so violent a rudeness, untenuated by any tangible form. Oh, great, it's a ghost. And now was acknowledged the presence of the Red Death. He had come like a thief in the night, and one by one dropped the revellers in the blood-bedewed halls of the revel, and died each in the despairing posture of his fall, and the life of the ebony clock went out with that of the last of the gay, and the flames of the tripod expired, and the darkness and decay and the Red Death held illimitable dominion over all. This is a story about people who hide from a pandemic, and then the shadow, the haunting of the plague itself, shows up and is like, yo, I'll kill you all. That would be like if the year 2020 showed up in 2021 as a ghost and was like, hey, remember me? So it's a really haunting narrative, and I don't think I would have found this narrative haunting before the year 2020, because honestly I live in a place of privilege where illness and disease are not a big problem in my life, or haven't been a big problem in my life up until this point. I don't know, I enjoyed that tale. I felt like Prince Prospero got what he deserved, which is unusual. Normally we get to the end of these tales and I'm like, wow, that was insane. Why did we read that? But I liked that one. So far, this has been my favorite tale from Edgar Allen Poe. It's also a very short one. Yeah, I got no criticisms, no commentary. I liked it. I feel like it's a good reflection of maybe what's going on in our society right now. Well, with all that in mind, I hope you have a great day, and I will talk to you later. Goodbye.